Do not touch her. The voice came from across the hall like a blade drawn in silence, and every single person in the grand ballroom of Ashvale Palace stopped breathing at the exact same moment. Seraphina Cole did not move. She could not move. The wine that Lady Isadora Vane had deliberately tipped from her goblet was still spreading across the front of Seraphina's pale silver gown, soaking into the fabric like a wound, and the laughter that had erupted from the circle of courtiers around her was still echoing off the vaulted ceilings when the laughter died. Just like that. Between one breath and the next. Because the king had spoken. Seraphina had been at Ashvale Palace for 43 days. In those 43 days, she had learned many things about survival in a court that had never wanted her. She had learned to keep her eyes low and her steps quiet. She had learned which hallways to avoid after sundown, and which servants would pass her an extra bread roll at breakfast without being asked. She had learned the names of every noble who mattered, and the precise degree of deference each one expected. And she had given it to them all without complaint, because that was what she had been sent here to do. She was Seraphina Cole, daughter of Aldrich Cole, alpha of the Fernwood Pack, a pack so small and so far from the seat of Lycan power that most of the courtiers at Ashvale had needed to consult a map to understand where she had come from. She had been sent as a symbol of peace, a gesture of submission, a piece on a board she had never been allowed to see. She had not been sent to matter. She had understood that from the very first day when she had stood in the receiving hall with her single traveling trunk and her carefully rehearsed curtsy, and the master of ceremonies had introduced her to the assembled court as the emissary of Fernwood, and Lady Isadora Vane, standing 3 steps to the right of the empty throne, had looked at her the way a person looks at a slightly interesting insect before returning to a much more important conversation. Seraphina had held her chin up, and her expression neutral, and had filed that moment away with all the others, because she was very good at filing moments away. She had been doing it her entire life, but she had never quite managed to file away the feeling of being seen by him. King Kaelin Ashvale had been watching her for 23 of the 43 days she had spent in his palace. She had not been supposed to notice. She was fairly certain he had not intended for her to notice, because noticing things about the King of Ashvale, the most powerful Lycan ruler in 300 years, was the kind of thing that could get an emissary from a minor pack into serious trouble. But Seraphina Cole had spent her entire life learning to notice things that were not meant for her, and the weight of those silver-gray eyes had a particular quality to it, a particular stillness, like the surface of a lake, just before something enormous moved beneath it, and she had felt it across crowded rooms and down long corridors, and once, memorably, from across the palace training grounds when she had been walking to the library and had happened to glance up at exactly the wrong moment. Or perhaps the right one. She was not thinking about any of that right now. Right now she was standing in the middle of the Ashvale Grand Ballroom on the night of the midwinter reception, with wine soaking through her gown, and Lady Isadora's laughter still ringing in her ears, and every eye in the room pinned to her face, waiting to see what she would do. And then the king had spoken. And now every eye in the room was somewhere else entirely. "I said," King Kaelin Ashvale repeated, and his voice was quieter the second time, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Do not touch her." Lady Isadora Vane was not a woman who frightened easily. She was 26 years old, the daughter of Duke Harlan Vane of the Northern Reaches, and she had been groomed since childhood for the role of Queen of Ashvale. She was extraordinarily beautiful, in the precise and deliberate way of someone who had studied beauty as a political instrument and mastered it completely. She had amber hair that caught the candlelight like spun gold, and eyes the color of new leaves, and a smile that she deployed with the accuracy of a skilled archer. She was also, Seraphina had learned in 43 days, genuinely intelligent, genuinely ruthless, and genuinely convinced that everything in Ashvale Palace, including its king, was either already hers or soon would be. It was a conviction so complete and so long-standing that it had calcified into something indistinguishable from fact in Isadora's mind, and anyone who threatened it, even accidentally, even by simply existing in proximity to things Isadora considered her own, was eventually going to feel the consequences. Serafina had felt those consequences twice before tonight. Once in the form of a mysteriously missing invitation to the harvest dinner that she had only recovered through the intervention of a sympathetic chambermaid. Once in the form of a training schedule alteration that had placed her in the advanced sparring ring with 3 warriors, who had very clearly been told to make her look incompetent in front of an audience. She had survived both incidents with her dignity mostly intact, and she had filed them away, and she had told herself that Isadora Vane was a problem she did not need to solve, because she was not here to win anything. She was here to exist quietly and represent her pack and go home at the end of the diplomatic season and never think about any of this again. Except that she was still here, and the king was still watching her. And Lady Isadora Vane was learning, for what Serafina suspected was the first time in her life, what it felt like to have done something that could not be easily corrected. "Your Majesty," Isadora said, and her voice was perfectly controlled, perfectly gracious, perfectly everything. "I am terribly sorry. It was an accident. I lost my balance." "You did not," the king said. The silence that followed was so complete that Serafina could hear the candles burning. Kaelin Ashvale crossed the ballroom floor slowly. He was not a man who moved quickly in public unless he had decided that speed was necessary. And right now he had clearly decided that slowness was the more effective weapon, because every step he took across the polished marble was another second in which every person in that room had nothing to do but watch him walk toward Serafina Cole. And the meaning of that walk, the deliberate, unhurried, absolutely unmistakable meaning of it, was landing on the assembled court, like stones dropped into still water. He was tall in the way that men who have spent decades training for war are tall, not merely in height, but in presence, in the way he occupied space, as if the room itself made room for him. His formal attire was black and silver, the colors of Ashvale, and his dark hair was swept back from a face that was all clean angles and controlled expression. And those eyes, those particular silver-gray eyes that Serafina had been trying very hard not to think about for 23 days, were fixed on her with an intensity that made something in her chest pull tight and then tighter still, like a cord she had not known existed being drawn toward something she could not yet see. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell the night air and cedar, and something darker, warmer, something that her wolf, her dormant, silent, long-sleeping wolf, stirred toward with a recognition that hit her like a physical blow. "Are you hurt?" he asked her. Just that. 3 words, spoken quietly, meant only for her. But in the silence of the ballroom, every syllable carried. "No," Serafina said, because she was not physically, not from the wine, not from Isadora's smile as the goblet had tipped. "I am not hurt, Your Majesty." "Good," he said. He held her gaze for one more moment, a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then he turned to face the room. "The midwinter reception is concluded for the evening," he said, and the authority in those words was so absolute that the assembled court began to move before the sentence was fully finished, the way a tide obeys without being told. "Lord Chamberlain, please see that Lady Isadora is escorted to her chambers. She appears to be unwell." The implication of that sentence, the precise and devastating implication of it, settled over Lady Isadora Vane's perfect face like a shadow. She was being dismissed. Not punished, not publicly humiliated, simply removed from the field, like a piece that had become a liability, and the elegance of it was so calculated that Serafina almost felt sorry for her. Almost. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her chamber in the east wing of the palace, a room she had come to know intimately in 43 days, with its blue curtains and its single window overlooking the training grounds and its fireplace that always burned too hot on the left side. And she stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened. She tried to think about it the way she thought about all the difficult things in her life, as a series of facts to be acknowledged and then placed in the appropriate mental compartment so that she could continue functioning. The facts were, the king had intervened. The king had crossed a room full of his own courtiers to stand in front of her. The king had spoken to her directly, quietly, as if she were someone whose well-being was worth being quiet for. These were facts. She had observed them herself. What she could not make into a fact, what refused to be reduced to something manageable, was the feeling. The particular and devastating feeling of that cord pulling in her chest when he had come close. The recognition that had moved through her dormant wolf like a shiver through deep water. She had been told about mate bonds. Every lichen was. It was part of their education, the way human children were told about gravity. It exists. It is real. It will, if the moon chooses it for you, change everything. She had grown up watching her parents bond with a child's uncomplicated wonder, not yet understanding what it had cost them to find each other, not yet understanding that the finding was only the beginning. She had spent her adolescence hoping, quietly, the way one hopes for something beautiful that one is not entirely certain one deserves. And then her wolf had gone silent at 17, had simply gone quiet in a way that no healer had been able to fully explain. And she had put the hoping away with the other things she had learned to put away, and she had told herself that some people were not meant for bonds, and that was all right. And she had believed it, mostly, until tonight. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum in the dark and breathed. She was being foolish. She was projecting onto a man who had intervened out of nothing more than a king's obligation to maintain order in his own court. She was a woman whose wolf had been silent for 7 years, lying alone in a palace where she was barely tolerated, reading significance into a single interaction, because she was lonely and unsettled, and the wine stain had not fully come out of her only formal gown. That was all this was. She told herself that very firmly, and eventually, somewhere near dawn, she slept. The morning brought a package to her door. She found it when she opened the chamber door at 7:30, a flat rectangular box of pale wood, with the Ashvale seal pressed into the silver wax that held it closed. Inside, wrapped in tissue as thin and soft as whispered words, was a gown. Not a replacement for the ruined one. Something far better. Silver silk, the precise color of winter moonlight, with long sleeves worked in the finest embroidery she had ever seen. Tiny wolves and stars and running figures that seemed to move when the fabric moved, as if the whole garment were alive with something it was trying to say. There was no note. There was no need for one. The seal alone had said everything. She stood in her chamber holding the gown and breathed very carefully for a long moment, and then she put it back in the box and closed the lid and set it on the writing desk and went to breakfast as if nothing had happened, because she was very practiced at that. She was halfway through her porridge when Captain Dren Ashvale, the king's cousin and the commander of the Royal Guard, sat down across from her without being invited. Dren was nothing like his cousin in appearance, broader and rougher-edged, with a soldier's direct gaze and an honest face that Serafina had always found easier to read than most of the faces at this court. He was one of perhaps 4 people at Ashvale Palace who had treated her with consistent, uncomplicated courtesy since her arrival, asking her nothing and offering nothing except a nod of acknowledgement in corridors and the occasional brief conversation about the training schedules she helped organize for the junior pack members. She had concluded, cautiously, that he was a good man. She had also concluded, correctly, that good men in courts like this one were never entirely uncomplicated. He picked it himself, Dren said without preamble, keeping his voice low. The gown. He went to Mistress Laurie's workroom last night after the reception. He described what he wanted. She made it this morning. Serafina set down her spoon. Captain Ashvale, I do not think you should be telling me this. No, Dren agreed pleasantly. Probably not. He poured himself tea from the carafe on the table as if they were simply sharing a meal. 43 days, he said. Do you know how long the last diplomatic emissary stayed before requesting a reassignment? No, she said. 11 days, Dren said. The one before that lasted 9. We have not had a successful diplomatic season in 4 years. The minor packs send their representatives and then the court chews them up, and they leave. and relations deteriorate further. And Kaelin spends another year trying to hold an alliance together through sheer force of will and the reasonable fear that he will destroy anyone who actively defects. He sipped his tea. You have lasted 43 days. You have attended every required function. You have mastered every protocol. You have learned the names of every household staff member below the rank of senior steward. You have not complained once, publicly, about anything. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. He noticed. I was sent here to be unobtrusive, Seraphina said carefully. You were sent here to be unimportant, Dren corrected, not unkindly. Those are not the same thing. And the distinction matters quite a lot right now, because certain members of this court have also noticed, and they are considerably less pleased about it than my cousin is. Seraphina thought about Lady Isadora's smile as the goblet tipped. Yes, she said. I am aware. Then you should also be aware, Dren said, setting down his cup and rising from the bench, that the ceremony of the sacred flames is in 12 days, and that it is the most politically significant ritual in the Ashvale calendar, and that certain decisions regarding the future of this kingdom are expected to be made public at that ceremony, and that your presence there will be unavoidable. He paused. Wear the gown. He left. Seraphina sat with her cooling porridge and the quiet morning noise of the great hall, and thought about 12 days and sacred flames and certain decisions, and tried very hard to feel nothing. At all. She was not entirely successful. The next 12 days had a different quality to them than the 43 that had come before. It was subtle. It was the kind of change that she might have missed if she had not spent her entire life developing an acute sensitivity to the texture of her own invisibility. Because the invisibility was changing. Not disappearing, not yet, not entirely, but thinning in ways she could not explain away. Courtiers who had passed her in corridors for 6 weeks, without acknowledgement, began to nod. The senior steward, a formidable woman named Magistra Helene, who had previously communicated with Seraphina exclusively through written notes, and speaking to her in the third person, even when they were standing directly in front of each other, stopped her in the East Wing hallway on the 4th day, and addressed her by name, and asked, with every appearance of genuine interest, how she was finding the library collection. On the 6th day, she was moved from the secondary dining table to the primary one, a change implemented without explanation by a junior footman who clearly knew better than to offer one. She noticed all of it. She catalogued it carefully. And every evening she stood at her chamber window and looked out at the training grounds below and tried to build a wall between herself and the conclusion that all of this was pointing toward, a conclusion that was warm and terrifying, and that her long-dormant wolf kept circling with an insistence that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. She saw the king 4 times in those 12 days. Each encounter was brief. Each was, to any outside observer, entirely proper and unremarkable. He passed her in the map room on the 2nd day and paused long enough to ask whether her chambers were comfortable. And she said yes, and he nodded and continued walking. He sat 3 seats from her at a council dinner on the 5th day and asked her a single question about the trade routes through Fernwood territory, and she answered it precisely, and he listened to the entirety of her answer, which was something she had learned not to expect from people at this court. He reviewed the junior training drills on the 8th day while she was running the morning session. And afterward, he said simply, "Well done," and walked away. And she stood in the middle of the training ground with the pale winter sun on her face, and her heart doing something embarrassing and involuntary in her chest, and told herself very firmly to stop it. The 4th encounter was different. It was late, past the hour when most of the palace had retired, and she was in the library because she could not sleep, because she almost never slept well in the days before anything important, and the library was the one place in Ashvale Palace that had felt like hers since the beginning. A high-ceilinged room on the 3rd floor of the north wing, filled with books that smelled of old paper and cedar oil, and the particular, peaceful weight of accumulated knowledge. She had developed over 43 days and now 12 more, a specific corner that she thought of as her own, a window seat with faded blue cushions, and a reading lamp that cast a warm circle of golden light. She was in that corner with a history of the Lycan territorial wars open on her lap when she heard the door. She did not look up immediately. She had learned that the library had other late-night visitors, and the policy she had adopted was to remain very still and very quiet, and trust that the architecture of the room would conceal her, because she had found that people said and did interesting and sometimes alarming things in libraries at night when they believed they were alone. She had learned more about the internal politics of Ashvale Palace from those overheard late-night conversations than from any amount of deliberate observation. But she looked up when the footsteps did not continue past her corner. They stopped. Kalen. Ashvale stood 3 feet from her reading nook with a book in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled authority of the throne room, not the cold assessment of the council chamber. Something more private. Something that looked to her careful and honest eye like the expression of a person who had walked to a place they had been trying to decide whether to walk to for a very long time, and had finally arrived and were not entirely sure what to do now that they had. "I thought you might be here," he said. "Your Majesty," she said, because she did not know what else to say. He sat down, not across from her but beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold library air, close enough that her wolf surged upward with that recognition again, that unbearable and specific recognition, and she gripped the spine of her book and breathed. He set his own book down without opening it, and looked at the dark window for a moment, and then looked at her. "Tell me about Fernwood," he said. She did. She did not know why, except that the quality of his attention when he asked was the kind that made not answering feel like a waste of something rare. She told him about the pine forests and the river that split the territory, and the way the pack hunted in winter when the snow was deep enough to muffle everything to silence. She told him about her father's quiet stubbornness, and her mother's sharp humor, and the annual gathering that brought all the smaller northern packs together for 3 days every autumn, a tradition that went back 400 years, and that the larger packs had never bothered to learn about, because they had never considered the small ones worth learning about. She talked for longer than she intended. She talked until she heard her own voice and was slightly horrified by how much of herself had come out in those words without her permission. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. Not perfunctory ones, not the questions of someone performing interest, but real questions. The questions of someone genuinely trying to understand something they had not understood before. "Why did your wolf go silent?" he asked at last, and the directness of it should have been rude, perhaps. But it was not. It was simply direct, the way he was, and she found that she did not mind it the way she had expected to. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I was 17. It was the autumn gathering. I woke one morning, and the wolf was simply gone. Not dead," the healers said. "Dormant, like something sleeping too deeply to be reached." She paused. "I used to think it was because I was not strong enough to hold it, that it had given up on me." She stopped, surprised at herself for saying that out loud. "I have not told many people that." "It did not give up on you," he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that she did not understand. Sometimes what looks like absence is waiting. She looked at him. He was looking at the window again, and his profile in the lamplight was composed and still, and the set of his jaw held something that she recognized as the specific tension of a person choosing their words with great care, because the wrong ones would cost too much. She felt the cord in her chest pull, steady and insistent, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost calm, "I know what this is. I know what this is, and I am not ready for it, and it does not matter whether I am. Ready because it is already here. 12 days, she said carefully. The sacred flames. Yes, he said. There are expectations, she said, regarding those flames, regarding announcements. There are always expectations, he said. Lady Isadora Vane's father has been at court for a week, she said. I do not think that is a coincidence. He turned to look at her then, and the silver gray of his eyes in the lamplight was a color she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. No, he said. It is not a coincidence. Duke Vane has been engineering this particular arrangement for 11 years. He is extremely capable and extremely patient, and he has several members of the High Council convinced that a match between his house and the Ashvale throne is the only viable path to long-term northern stability. He paused. He may even be right about the stability. But, she said softly. The corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. But, he agreed. She woke in the morning to the sound of raised voices in the corridor outside her chamber, and to the first cold whisper of something being wrong. She lay still for a moment, listening with a focus sharpened by years of understanding that the tone of voices in corridors often told you more than the words. What she heard in these voices was controlled urgency, the kind that meant something significant had happened in the night and was currently being managed before the rest of the palace became aware of it. She rose and dressed quickly in the plain training clothes she wore in the mornings and opened her door. 2 palace guards she did not recognize were posted at the end of the corridor. Not the usual rotation, heavier, better armed. One of them looked at her with an assessment that was slightly too thorough for simple duty, and she noted it and said nothing, and went to find Captain Dren. She found him in the east courtyard, with 3 of his senior officers, deep in a conversation that stopped when she approached. He looked at her face, and then over her shoulder at the guard she had passed, and something in his expression shifted from the controlled opacity of a soldier managing a situation to something more direct and more concerned. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the far end of the courtyard where the fountain provided a useful noise barrier. "Someone accessed the archive room last night," he said quietly. "The room where the records of the bloodline treaties are kept. Several documents are missing. We do not yet know what was taken or why." She felt the cold touch her. "The bloodline treaties," she said. "Those include the records of the northern pack lineages." "All pack lineages," he said. "Going back 600 years. He watched her. "Including the records of certain bloodlines that were considered lost, absorbed into smaller packs over generations. Forgotten." She went still. "The Fernwood Pack," he said carefully, "was established approximately 400 years ago by a group of Lycans who came from the Western Territories. There are not many records of that migration in the primary histories because it was a chaotic period. But the archive contains older documents, records that have not been publicly referenced in at least 2 centuries. He paused. "I am telling you this because Kaelin told me to tell you, and because I think you need to understand what the next few days may bring." "What bloodline?" she said flatly. "Do those records describe?" Dren looked at her steadily. "The Ashvale secondary line," he said. "A branch that was believed to have died out during the separation wars. That apparently did not." The world rearranged itself around her in the quiet morning courtyard, with the fountain noise covering everything. She thought of her father, steady and quiet, and always a little sad when she asked about their ancestors. Always a little evasive. She thought of her wolf, dormant since 17, since the autumn. Gathering. Since the night she had overheard her parents speaking in the kitchen, in voices too low for her to catch the words, but with a weight she had never forgotten. She thought of the king in the library, saying, "Sometimes what looks like absence is waiting," with a certainty she had not understood. "He knows," she said. "He has suspected," Dren said carefully. "For some time." "How long?" A pause. "Since you arrived." She pressed her hand against her chest, over the cord that was no longer a flutter but a steady pull, like a tide. She breathed in and breathed out, and thought very deliberately about what she knew and what she did not know, and what she needed to figure out before the ceremony of the sacred flames in 2 days' time. "The documents that were taken," she said. "Who would want them?" "Someone who would prefer that what they contain never becomes public knowledge," Dren said. She thought of Isadora Vane's smile. She thought of Duke Harlan Vane and 11 years of patient engineering and a council convinced of the only viable path. She thought of someone who had a great deal to lose if a forgotten bloodline was suddenly remembered. "I need to speak with the king," she said. He knows, Dren said. He is waiting for you. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. She had been to the king's private study only once before, during the formal reception of credentials on her first day, when she had stood in the doorway with her geir, letter of introduction and her careful curtsy, and had been aware of him in the way that one is aware of something enormous and still. It was a different experience the second time. The room was the same, high-windowed and book-lined with a map table that took up most of the center and chairs that were clearly chosen for utility over comfort. But the atmosphere was different, stripped of ceremony, and he was standing at the map table when she entered, and he looked at her with those gray eyes, and there was no distance in them today, no careful management, just him, and whatever this was, and 12 years of a dormant wolf that had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment to decide that dormancy was no longer an option. She felt it happen as she crossed the threshold. She felt it the way she imagined one would feel a dam breaking, not violently, but irrevocably, the slow and absolute release of something that had been held back for a very long time. Her wolf woke, not gradually, all at once, like a fire catching, like light filling a room, like something remembering that it had always been there. She stopped walking. Her hand went to her chest. The warmth flooded outward through her ribs and into her limbs, and she stood in the doorway of the king's study and breathed and felt, for the first time in 7 years, complete. There it is, Calen Ashvale said quietly, and his voice had something in it she had never heard from him before, something that sounded like relief, like a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time, finally letting it go. You knew, she said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact, made by a woman who was still adjusting to the sensation of wholeness, which was stranger and more overwhelming than she had expected. You knew what I was. I knew what my instincts told me, he said. The first time I saw you, in this room, on the first day. The bond recognition is not subtle when it arrives, but recognition is not confirmation. I needed to be certain before I acted on anything. He paused. And you deserve to discover the truth of your own bloodline without it being forced on you by my convenience. She looked at him across the map table. She thought about 43 days of being mostly invisible. She thought about him watching her, silent and patient and careful. The documents from the archive, she said. We will recover them, he said with complete certainty. Dren has 3 people already tracing where they went. We know who ordered the theft. Isadora's father. Isadora's father, he confirmed. He has powerful allies on the council. He will argue that the documents are fraudulent. He will argue that the bloodline claim is politically motivated. He will be very persuasive. His jaw was set. It will not matter. Why not? She said. Because there is a simpler confirmation than any document, he said. More ancient. More absolute. He looked at her steadily. The sacred flames respond to the Ashvale bloodline. It is the oldest of our traditions, older than the throne itself. A fire that was kindled 600 years ago and has burned continuously since. Every member of the Ashvale line who approaches it receives a response. A confirmation that cannot be forged or argued away or stolen from an archive. He paused. The secondary line has not had a surviving member in 200 years. No one has expected a response from it in living memory. She understood. She felt the full weight of what she was being told settle into her with the strange calm that sometimes accompanied very large things, the stillness that comes when something is both inevitable and enormous. The ceremony of the sacred flames, she said. In 2 days, he said. In front of the entire assembled court. And you intend to bring me to those flames. I intend to give you the choice, he said. And the care with which he said it made something in her chest ache. Your bloodline. Your decision. What it means for your life, your future, your pack. All of that is yours to decide. I will not make that decision for you. But I wanted you to have the knowledge before you made it. I wanted you to know what you are." She was quiet for a long moment. The wolf in her chest was warm and certain and pacing steadily, and the cord between them hummed. "What am I?" she said softly. He held her gaze. "Mine," he said simply. "If you want to be." She had expected that sentence to frighten her. She had spent lifetime learning to expect the worst from the things she wanted most. And this was the largest thing she had ever wanted. And so the fear should have been proportional. But what she felt instead was the wolf's certainty, clean and absolute. A thing that had apparently been waiting for 7 years to say exactly what it knew. "Yes," she said. And the word was the easiest thing she had ever spoken. The next 2 days were the most complicated of her life. Dren's people traced the stolen documents to a courier in the employ of Duke Vane's household by the end of the first day, which was faster than she had expected, and which told her that the cover had been hasty, put together by someone who had been moving quickly rather than carefully. That told her something else. It told her that someone had panicked, had felt the ground shifting under their careful construction, and had grabbed at the most immediately available solution without thinking clearly about the long-term consequences. She filed that away. People who panicked were often more dangerous than people who planned, because they were harder to predict. Isadora Vane came to her chamber on the morning of the second day. She came alone, without attendants, which was itself a statement of something. She knocked, which was more than Serafina had expected. She was wearing a morning gown in deep green that suited her beautifully, and her amber hair was simply dressed, and her face, stripped of the particular performance she usually wore in public, was something that Serafina found she could almost feel sorry for. Almost, but not quite, and not yet. "I would like to speak with you," Isadora said from the doorway. Truthfully, Serafina stepped back and let her in. Isadora stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the silver gown hanging on the wardrobe door, and then looked at Serafina. And her expression was the most honest one Serafina had seen on her face. "My father told me you were nothing," she said. "He said you were a political gesture, something to be managed. He said the only threat you posed was the attention you might draw, which was manageable with the right pressure, which he had arranged for." She paused. "He did not mention the other things." "The bloodline," Serafina said. "He knew," Isadora said quietly. "He knew before you arrived. There was information that came to him years ago, before you were sent here. He did not tell me. He managed it. He removed the relevant documents from circulation, and he arranged for certain council records to be obscured, and he told me that his plan was solid." Her voice was very steady. "He used me, my ambitions, my years of preparation. He built his plan on top of them because it was convenient, and because I was already fully committed." She stopped. "I did not know about the bloodline. I did not know about the documents he had already moved. I only knew that you were a threat to be removed." Serafina looked at her, carefully. She thought about 43 days and the missing invitation and the sparring ring and the wine. She thought about a woman who had been groomed for a role since childhood and had poured everything she had into preparing for it, and had been, in the end, just another piece on her own father's board. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to be left out of what happens tonight," Isadora said. "My father will face the consequences of what he did. I understand that. But I would ask that. You remember that I did not know about the theft. I did not know about the documents." A pause. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did to you. I am asking for an honest account." "An honest account is all I have ever asked for in this palace," Serafina said. "I can give you that." Isadora looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite relief, and not quite something else. Only the particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing a role. For so long they had almost forgotten there was a person underneath it. She nodded once, and she left. And Serafina stood in her chamber, and breathed, and thought that perhaps there were more kinds of courage than the obvious ones. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The ceremony of the sacred flames was held in the Great Hall of Ashvale, which was the oldest part of the palace, built of black stone that predated the current dynasty by 3 centuries, and that had the particular quality of very old buildings, a weight and a depth that made the air inside feel different from the air outside, denser with time and with the accumulated significance of everything that had happened within those walls. The sacred flames themselves burned in a stone basin at the center of the hall, a low, wide bowl carved from a single piece of mountain granite and filled with a fire that had no visible source of fuel, that burned in colors that shifted between deep amber and pale silver, and occasionally, on significant occasions, a blue so bright it was almost white. The fire had burned continuously, by tradition, and by what Serafina now understood was something considerably older and more fundamental than tradition, for 612 years. The court was assembled in full. Every noble house with a seat at the Ashvale table was represented. Every ambassador, every council member, every significant figure in the political landscape of the Lycan world, all standing in the rings of observance that surrounded the flame basin, their faces arranged in the careful neutrality of people who understand that they are watching something that will be referenced for the rest of their lives. Duke Harlan Vane stood near the front of the assembly, and his face was composed and pleasant, and revealed nothing, which told Serafina that he had not yet been informed of what Dren had recovered. That was, she thought, deliberate. Give him nothing until the moment when nothing could be changed. She stood at the back of the assembly in the silver gown. She had put it on that morning with hands that were entirely steady, which had surprised her a little given the circumstances. But the wolf was steady too, warm and present, and certain in the way that she was slowly learning to recognize as its natural state. Not the dramatic certainty of a thing that had just woken, but the deep bedrock certainty of something that had always known exactly where it belonged, and had simply been waiting, for 7 years, for the conditions to be right. The ceremony opened with the traditional recitation, performed by the high priest, a man of advanced age and remarkable composure who had clearly done this many times, and understood that the power of ceremony lay in its precision. Names were spoken. Lineages were acknowledged. The flames responded to each member of the primary Ashvale line in turn, and the responses were the familiar. Colors, amber and silver, beautiful and expected. The court watched with appropriate reverence. Then Kaelin spoke. Before the annual declarations, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the old black stone hall, there is a matter of lineage to be addressed, a matter that concerns the flames themselves. He paused, and in the pause, Serafina felt the quality of the assembled court's attention change. There is a member of the Ashvale secondary line present in this hall tonight. A line that has been absent from these flames for 200 years. I am asking that member to come forward. The silence was absolute. She walked forward. She heard the sound of it, the intake of breath across the assembled court, as she moved through the rings of observance toward the flame basin, and she kept her eyes level, and her steps steady, and her wolf warm and certain at the core of her. She was aware of Duke Vane's face changing as she passed him, the composed pleasantness cracking into something with much harder edges beneath it. She did not look at him. She walked to the flame basin, and she stopped and she looked into the fire. For a moment nothing happened. The flames burned in their shifting amber and silver, and the silence of the hall was so complete that she could hear her own breathing, and she thought with a clarity that was almost detached. This is the moment. Whatever I am is about to be confirmed or denied in front of every person who matters in this world, and I am not afraid, and that itself is something, and the wolf is not afraid either, and we are here, we are here, we are present and whole and real, and whatever the fire says, we will carry it forward. The fire turned blue, not gradually, not tentatively. A full, immediate, brilliant blue, the blue of deep winter sky at midnight, the blue that every Lycan scholar who had ever written about the sacred flames described as the rarest and most significant response in the fire's 600-year history. A response that indicated not merely bloodline confirmation, but something more. Something that the old texts called resonance, a word they used to describe the specific harmony between a person and the lineage they carried. The harmony that indicated not just that a bloodline was present, but that it was, after generations of dormancy, finally, fully, awake. The sound that moved through the assembled court was not quite a gasp, and not quite silence, but something between them, the sound of people, recalibrating everything they had believed to be true. She stood in the blue light of the oldest fire in the Lycan world, and felt her wolf lift its head, and she breathed. The secondary Ashvale line, the high priest said, and his voice was not quite steady, has returned. Duke Harlan Vane made his move then, because he was a man of considerable capability, and he had not built 11 years of careful construction to watch it unravel without a fight. He stepped forward from the assembly, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent decades in political chambers, confident and measured and carrying the weight of a very large stake. The records of the secondary line were lost centuries ago, he said clearly. Without documentary confirmation, this spectacle, however theatrical, is insufficient evidence of a legitimate claim. The flames are ancient, and their interpretation is subject to scholarly debate. I move that this matter be referred to the full council for proper investigation before any conclusions are drawn. Kaelin looked at him. Just looked at him, in the blue light of the sacred flames, and the quality of that look was the quality of someone who has been waiting patiently for a particular chess piece to make a particular move, and has now watched it happen exactly as anticipated. The documents that were removed from the Royal Archive, Kaelin said, have been recovered. They are currently in the possession of the High Priest, who has confirmed their authenticity. They include the complete lineage records of the Fernwood migration, the treaty documents of the Separation Wars, and the personal record of the last Ashvale secondary linekeeper, written in the 600-year-old hand that the archivists have already verified. He paused. They also include a notation, in that same hand, regarding a particular dormancy, a protective dormancy, placed upon the secondary line's most vulnerable members during the war period, designed to conceal their power until it was safe to reveal. The notation describes the conditions under which the dormancy would lift. He looked at Seraphina, and in the blue light of the sacred flames, his gray eyes were the color of everything she had ever hoped for. It would lift in the presence of the true mate. The hall erupted, not into chaos, but into the particular controlled uproar of politically sophisticated people receiving information that fundamentally changes the landscape and needing to process it very quickly, while maintaining the appearance of composure. Duke Vane's face had gone through several transitions in the past 30 seconds, and had currently arrived at the particular expression of a man understanding that he has miscalculated on a very large scale, and that the consequences of that miscalculation are about to become extremely specific. Seraphina turned to face the assembled court, standing in the blue light of the ancient fire, and she thought about 43 days of invisibility. And she thought about a library at midnight, and a man who had asked her about Fernwood with genuine curiosity. And she thought about a wolf that had been sleeping for 7 years, and had woken up all at once in a doorway. And she thought about her father's quiet eyes, and her mother's sharp humor, and the autumn gathering, and the river, and the pine forests, and everything she had carried with her from a small pack that most of this court had needed a map to find. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She was the end of a line that the world had believed extinct, and she was the mate of the most powerful Alpha King in 3 centuries. And she was the daughter of a man whose ancestors had carried an ancient bloodline through generations of careful and loving concealment. And she was, above all of this and beneath all of this, and woven through all of it, herself, Seraphina Cole, who had survived 43 days in a court that had not wanted her, and many more years. Before that, in a world that had not entirely known what to do with her, and who had arrived here anyway, in a silver gown, in blue firelight, with a wolf at full waking, and a cord in her chest that pulled toward the man crossing the floor toward her. Kaelin stopped in front of her. Around them, The hall was very alive with the controlled uproar of a court in the process of recalibrating, and none of it touched them. He looked at her in the blue light, and the corner of his mouth moved in that thing that was not quite a smile and was better than a smile. And he extended his hand, and she looked at his hand, and then at his face. And then she put her hand in his, and felt the bond complete between them with a warmth so total and so absolute that she closed her eyes for 1 second and simply breathed it in. "The secondary Ashvale line has returned," Kaelin said to the hall, and his voice carried the way it always carried, to every corner and every ear. "And the King of Ashvale has found his mate." The blue fire burned. The hall went quiet with the particular quiet of a thing being witnessed. And Seraphina Cole, daughter of Fernwood, blood of Ashvale, stood in the oldest room in the oldest palace in the Lycan world, with the wolf awake in her chest and the king's hand in hers, and understood, with a completeness that left no room for doubt, that this was not the end of anything. This was the beginning, the very particular and irreversible beginning of something that had been waiting, patient as a dormant wolf, for exactly the right moment to wake. The weeks that followed the ceremony of the sacred flames were not simple. Seraphina had not expected them to be simple. She had been in this court long enough to understand that the revelation of a lost royal bloodline and the announcement of a king's mate was not the kind of thing that resolved itself neatly in the immediate aftermath of a dramatic ceremony. However powerful the symbolism had been, however absolute the fire's confirmation. What it was, instead, was the beginning of a very complicated process involving a great many conversations and a significant number of political adjustments, and the careful, patient work of converting a court that had been structured around certain expectations into one that could accommodate a different future. Duke Harlan Vane and 3 of his senior council allies were formally removed from their positions within a week, their offenses documented precisely and thoroughly. The evidence Dren had gathered presented to the full council in a proceeding that was, Seraphina was told, rather brisk by the standards of formal political censure. Duke Vane departed Ashvale with his reputation significantly reduced and his 11-year project reduced to rubble, and he did so without Isadora, who had been given, per her conversation with Seraphina and the honest account she had been promised, a separate proceeding that reflected her actual role rather than her father's. Isadora Vane remained at court. Not in her previous position, not with her previous ambitions intact, but with her dignity, which Seraphina suspected was what she had actually been asking for when she had come to the chamber door on the morning of the ceremony. Seraphina sent word to Fernwood. She wrote the letter herself, to her father, and she wrote it carefully and with great love, because what she had to say was not simple, and she wanted to say it well. She told him what she had learned about the bloodline and the dormancy and the keeper's notation, and she told him she understood why he had kept it from her, and she told him she was not angry, which was true, and she told him she needed him to tell her everything he knew, which was also true, and she told him she was well, and she was whole, and the wolf was awake, and she had met her mate, and she hoped that the last part of that was not too much of a surprise. She suspected it was not. Her father's reply came 12 days later. It was brief, as his communications always were, and it was warm, as his communications also always were when the subject warranted warmth, and it said, among other things, "I have been waiting for that fire to turn blue for longer than you have been alive. I am glad you were braver than I was." She read it twice, and then she folded it and put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered most, and she sat at the window overlooking the training grounds and thought about courage and patience, and the particular bravery of people who carry heavy things quietly for a very long time. She learned the palace differently in the weeks after the ceremony. Not from the outside, as an emissary navigating a foreign court, but from the inside, as someone who was going to be here, who was putting down roots in this place, however reluctantly it had once received her. She learned which council members were genuinely capable, and which were political ornaments. She learned the household rhythms, and the seasonal patterns and the particular geography of the king's schedule, the hours he spent in the training grounds, and the hours he spent at the map table, and the late evenings in the library that had, she had come to understand, been happening for considerably longer than the 23 days she had noticed, and that had shifted in character since she had begun joining him there with comfortable regularity, becoming something different from solitude, something that suited both of them better than solitude had. She learned him. Slowly, because he was not a simple man and did not reveal himself quickly, and because she respected that, having been raised in a pack where privacy was understood as a form of dignity and not as concealment. She learned that the coldness she had observed in formal settings was not coldness at all, but a very specific kind of focus, the focus of a man who took his responsibilities so seriously that he had somewhere along the way conflated all of his public self with those responsibilities and had left very little room for anything else, and that the work of her presence was not to challenge that focus, but to provide somewhere that it could relax. She learned that he laughed rarely but genuinely, and that the sound of it was one of the best things she had ever heard. She learned that he had read nearly every book in the library, and that his opinions on most of them were strong and interesting, and sometimes wrong in ways that were extremely entertaining to argue about. She learned that he had been carrying the knowledge of her bloodline and the weight of what it meant for months before her arrival, having received intelligence from his own archivists the previous summer, and that the patience with which he had waited for her to discover her own truth had cost him something, had been genuinely difficult, and that he had done it anyway because he understood that some things had to be arrived at freely or not at all. She told him, one evening in the library with the lamps burning low and the fire comfortable, that she thought that was one of the finest things she had ever heard about anyone. He looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "You would have done the same." She thought about it. "Yes," she said, "I would have." The formal binding ceremony, which was what the Lycan world called what humans might have called an engagement, and which had considerably more ancient weight to it than that human institution, was held 6 weeks after the ceremony of the sacred flames, in the same great hall, with the same assembled court, and with the sacred flames burning their steady amber and silver in the stone basin at the center of the room. Seraphina stood before those flames in a gown she had chosen herself. Not silver this time, but white, with details picked out in the blue that the fire had shown. And she stood there with the wolf warm and certain and full of light, and the cord between herself, and the man beside her so strong and so steady it felt like something she had been born carrying and had only just learned the name of. When the high priest asked the ritual questions, she answered them in the clear and carrying voice of someone who has made a decision that does not feel like a decision at all, that feels like an arrival. Yes, she accepted the bond freely. Yes, she had come to it by her own choice. Yes, she understood what she was taking on and what she was offering in return. The flames turned blue at the moment of the formal acknowledgement and stayed blue through the entire ceremony, which the high priest later said, in a somewhat stunned tone, he had never seen happen before in 60 years of performing this ritual. She found that she did not find this entirely surprising. The formal ceremony was followed by a reception that lasted, by the standards of Ashvale, not very long, because neither of them had strong feelings about standing in a room being congratulated for an extended period of time, and they had reached a comfortable accord about such things that expressed itself in the smooth and unstated efficiency with which the reception concluded at a reasonable hour, and the guests found themselves distributed toward their own chambers, and the great hall quieted. She stood at the window of what had been her chamber for nearly 3 months, and was no longer precisely her chamber alone, and looked out at the training grounds in the dark, quiet palace, and she breathed in the night air that carried pine somewhere in it, a wind off the northern forests, and thought about Fernwood, and about this place, and about the distance between them that was no longer the distance it had been, and about the question of what home meant when you had been multiple places and the answer had changed. Home was the library at midnight, and the warm fire, and the man who asked questions and listened to the entirety of the answers. Home was the wolf, finally awake, finally certain, pacing steadily and contentedly in the warm space behind her ribs where it had been silent for 7 years. Home was the blue fire, and the cord, and the choice that had not felt like a choice, because it had felt so completely and undeniably right. She was not finished. She understood that clearly. The court was still adjusting. The political landscape was still shifting. Her father was traveling from Fernwood and would arrive in 2 weeks, and there would be conversations she needed to have with him that would be important, and probably complicated, and almost certainly tearful at some point. There was the work ahead of her, the real work, of understanding what her role in this place would be, and building it carefully and with the same patience and precision she had applied to surviving in it. There were council members who would need to be won over, and traditions to be learned, and a kingdom that would take time to accept her the way the flames had accepted her, completely and all at once. But she was not afraid of any of it. She had spent a long time being afraid, in the quiet, private way of someone who has learned not to show it. And that time was over. The wolf was awake. The bond was real. The fire had confirmed what she had known from the moment she had stood in a doorway and felt everything become clear. And she had chosen, freely and fully, to walk toward it. Behind her, she heard him cross the room, and she felt the warmth of him before he reached her. And the wolf lifted its head with that steady and absolute recognition. He stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the dark training grounds together. And the silence between them was the kind of silence that is not empty, but full. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Fernwood," she said. "And here, and the distance between them that is not as large as it used to be." "No," he agreed. "Not as large." She turned to look at him, this man who had crossed a room full of his own. Court to stand between her and a deliberate unkindness, who had gone to a seamstress in the middle of the night to describe a gown that matched what he had seen when he looked at her, who had kept the knowledge of her bloodline and the weight of his own certainty for months without pressing her toward a conclusion she had needed to arrive at herself, and whose gray eyes in the dark were the color of something she no longer needed a word for. "I am glad I stayed," she said. "Past the 11 days. Past the 9. I am glad you stayed," he said. "Past all of them." The wolf in her chest was warm and full and running free, and the cord between them was the strongest thing she had ever felt. And outside the window the night was quiet over Ashvale, over the black stone walls and the old roots of this ancient place. And she breathed it all in, the pine and the cold, and the steady certainty of a future she had not known she was walking toward until she was already standing inside it. She put her hand in his, in the dark, at the window, and she let herself have it, all of it, the belonging and the bond and the blue fire and the home she had found on the other side of everything she had survived. She let herself have it without apology, without qualification, without the careful, measured hope of someone who has learned to want things quietly in case the wanting is overheard. She wanted this. She had it. She was here. And that, after everything, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?